Hello and welcome to a very special episode of Zero Hanger TV. I'm your host, Phoenix Trinidad, and today I'm joined by Niall Seewang. Hey, mate.
How you going?
Yeah, thank you for coming on the show. You've been in AFL footy media for about 15 years. Is that right?
That's correct. No longer involved day to day, but yeah, spent a lot of time following footy and reporting on it and being involved in the print side of things.
Yeah, beautiful. So you're on the show today because we have started a nice little collaboration with Zero Hanger. We're building a podcast called AFL Team Builders. So did you want to give us a little rundown on what is AFL Team Builders and what prompted this podcast?
Yeah, so AFL Team Builders is, I guess, an idea that I've had bubbling around in my head for about 18 months, prompted by the AFL launching a team in Tasmania, my home state, and the fact that people are going to have to build this club from the ground up. What sparked it, I guess, more specifically was Grant O'Brien being named the first chair, the inaugural chairman of the AFL team in Tasmania. And it made me wonder, wow, what a lot of pressure on one person to start building a club from the ground up. And that made me think even further back that probably every expansion club's had that same pressure. One or two key employees having to, chase tail and build things from scratch, appoint key personnel, and it made me want to investigate all the other expansion teams outside of Victoria.
Yeah. So you've only spoken to people from the non-Victorian teams. Yeah.
That's correct. Apologies to Victorian footy fans. Hopefully there's enough interesting, storylines from those clubs outside of Victoria. But basically and simply, we couldn't, speak to people involved with the creation of the Victorian teams because some of them 150 years ago.
Yeah.
Simply it was a timeliness period. The Swans were the first team to move from South Melbourne to Sydney in 82, and that gave us enough. That timeline was enough for us to talk to the key, decision makers of each club that launched outside of Victoria as the game went national.
Yeah. So you've done a series. So who did you speak to, sort of broad range? Because you've spoken to a lot of people from each club.
That's right. I wanted to speak to the key people who are involved with setting up each club, often on the field. So inaugural presidents, CEOs, coaches, board members, players, and employees that were involved with setting up every club. So a lot of legwork, some great stories, a lot of learning from me. I didn't know what went into building these teams. Certainly not further back. In the 80s and early 90s. So some incredible stories from each club and what went into establishing them.
Yeah. So I was born in 93. So my experience of that, I was born into the AFL era essentially. And in terms of expansion clubs, I only really knew, Gold Coast and GWS, which I'm sure a lot of people are the same in my generation. So let's go back to, West Coast and that. So who had the toughest sort of experience coming into the AFL as an expansion club?
Yeah,
West Coast were the first, right?
No, well, Sydney.
Sydney,
depends what you count as a club build. So Sydney, South Melbourne was already a foundation VFL club. Mm-hmm. They were struggling financially and got a leg up to move up to Sydney, and they almost, packed up and moved to Sydney. Mm-hmm. That story is fascinating in itself. The fact that South Melbourne was almost broken in two for those that wanted to stay and those that thought the opportunity was too good to move to Sydney. So they were in 1982, but then the first true expansion teams, if you like, were West Coast and Brisbane in 87.
Yeah, absolutely. So do you have a favourite episode or a favourite sort of build or story from...
Yeah, I do. Probably Brisbane's my favourite, primarily because it was so hard what they did. Every club that got built had its difficulties. So much work goes into building those things. So many errors are made, so many lessons are learned. But I think the clubs that got built in football states or football heartland states had it easier. The culture, they're already in an established footy culture. So using West Coast and Brisbane for an example, two clubs that kick-started the national expansion in 1987, West Coast was already a footy mad state. They already had access to great state league players. Brisbane had nothing. Footy was hardly known up in Brisbane at that time, up in Queensland. They had 5 months to build a club. The AFL said,
crazy.
you know, we here you go. You know, we're going to try and expand nationally, starting with these two states. Mm-hmm. I think they both had 5 months to build, and yes, difficult for West Coast, but as I said, they had I guess firmer foundations to build from. Whereas Brisbane, they had nothing to build from up there. The local player access to build, you know, from their squad was pretty dire. Mm-hmm. And then, crazily enough, they had private ownership, and a lot of people of your age, possibly even a bit older, probably wouldn't have heard of a man called Christopher Skase, who was one of Australia's most notorious businessmen at the time. Later became a fugitive on the run as his business empire collapsed. But he was the money behind Brisbane, and some of the stories from his time leading the Brisbane Bears as they were, it's unfathomable what he got away with. You know, including, you know, just on the season's eve, he had a resort on the Gold Coast. So he said, let's build the team's stadium on the Gold Coast, even though it's going to be a Brisbane-based team. So trying to engage with locals in the Brisbane market suddenly became almost impossible because they're an hour and a half down the road on the Sunset Strip.
Right. So that's great. So they had 5 months going from, you know, hiring the first employee to playing their first game, essentially.
That's right. Hiring employees, building squads, building infrastructure. You know, so many stories of those early years of all these startup clubs were, you know, administration working out of tin sheds, or, you know, there's a famous anecdote from Graham Corns at the Adelaide Crows, and they had they didn't have a gym, and they had to I guess transform one of the bars at Football Park into a makeshift gym for the players. Wow. Only big enough for a handful of players at each time, so they'd file in, do their workout, and file out, and that's just one such story of the difficulties they all faced in those early years. And
it was a little while between, you know, those. I think it was Fremantle, and then maybe 15 years later until Gold Coast came in.
That's right.
Were there any sort of like lessons learned from Gold Coast for Gold Coast and GWS coming into the comp that they'd learned from those previous first expansion teams?
Yeah, I think there was. I think the biggest change was the mindset shift. Early days, the AFL asked or demanded a license fee from the clubs that were built.
Right.
So $4 million back in 1987 was a lot of money.
Yep.
And the AFL demanded that. They almost asked these clubs to pay their way into the competition. And then the VFL, as it was then, disseminated some of that money to their struggling Victorian clubs. The biggest change for GWS and Gold Coast was how much the AFL needed them to work. So instead of demanding money from these clubs that started up, the AFL just flooded them with as much money and support as they could. Mm-hmm. And then you could argue that they may or may not have used their money and their concessions wisely, but the AFL had to support them and make them work, as opposed to, I guess, taking their money off them and then saying, you know, it's all yours, we're not going to really be hands-on.
Yeah.
So that was probably the biggest change in that time period.
Yeah, but that's what's interesting to me too, because, you know, I hear like Gold Coast are essentially always like touted as they're an AFL club, like the AFL's they've been very hands-on with them. But then we still hear stories about how that in their early days they were training out of tin sheds still as well. Like you would assume that the AFL would just like pump as much money into them and to make them successful. But GWS doesn't seem to have that feeling. Like they have their own sort of culture, and I think that probably comes with, you know, wins on the board.
Yeah.
But what was interesting to me as we were putting this production together was for Gold Coast and GWS, I remember when they first came into the competition, they were, you know, just at the bottom of the table every year for the first couple of years. But I think it's Adelaide won their first game when they first came in. So it was very different. That was really surprising to me because I assume when an expansion club comes in, they're going to be bad for a long time.
Yep.
Whereas some of these other older clubs that came in, they were winning games in their first seasons. Like,
yeah, I guess a younger generation such as yourself, you'd only view expansion through the lens of Gold Coast and Greater Western Sydney.
Yep.
You probably assume that, when a new club comes in, they sort of bunker down, they accumulate draft assets and just wait for them all to come on. But certainly in the earlier days, the clubs built more, I guess, from a more solid foundation of senior players. They had more access to state league players as well. And back in the days, there was no draft as well, so they just had to get the most mature bodies available.
Yeah.
And yeah, certainly some were more immediately competitive.
So was there any, do you have a favourite single anecdote or moment from some of the people that you interviewed?
Yeah, I don't know how long we've got. There's quite a few. There's some of the stories are fantastic that just make, unless you are in those meetings and in the club as it was getting built, no one would ever know what really took place. So I'm really thankful for some of the people that opened up to me. I've got quite a few. One of my favourites was Mark Bickley, two-time Crows premiership captain. I think he played 280 odd games. Fantastic player. But he detailed to me that he only just learnt from Graham Corns how lucky he was to actually get on the training list at the Crows. I think they had 70 players train in their first pre-season, and he only got on because of a quota from his Sandford club, and they were short. And they said, young Mark Bickley's not too bad, let's bring him in the training squad. And then when that was cut down for 42 before the start of the season, he wasn't on the list. And somehow, when it was lodged, his name was on the list. And they're the sliding door. And he only just learnt this 30 years later.
Yeah. And he went on to win 2 premierships.
Yeah. And I talked to him about that. And I said, I'm sure you would have made it in your football career anyway. And he said, look, I'm not sure. You never know how where life's going to take you.
Yeah.
And to this day, he and Graham Corns don't understand how his name wasn't on the list the day before it's going to get lodged, and then was in the official squad when the AFL unveiled the squad.
Yeah. So that was another thing that was surprising to me, is that Adelaide were formed as a representative state team, essentially. So they had to pick players from existing, from like a couple from each Sandford club.
That's right. They needed to gather statewide support. There's so much politics in South Australian footy. I guess probably every state body has its politics, but they had to have an equal number from every SANFL team to build that initial squad.
Yeah.
I think Mark Bickley was saying that there were 2 powerhouse Sandford teams at the time, and he thought that you could probably just get 30 players from those 2 teams, and it would have been just about good enough to play AFL. But they had to spread the talent across all the clubs to make sure they got statewide support.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Incredible. So as a native Tasmanian, with the Tassie team coming in 2028,
fingers crossed, that's the plan.
Yeah, that's the plan, pending that stadium build. So how are you looking towards that Tassie team getting built now, knowing what you know? And yeah.
Yeah, it was interesting. I did touch on the Tasmanian build during each interview, and there was 2 key themes that came out, like in terms of wanting it or needing it to be successful. One, it sounds obvious, but one is get the right people involved. The key decision makers early are so vital. The inaugural CEO, the inaugural coach, the choosing the captain to set that on-field culture, absolutely crucial. And it's probably difficult to know exactly if the people that you put in those positions are the right people until years down the track. So, you just got to do your research and get the right people in place. And the other one is the list build. There's so many interesting list build stories in this. Fremantle, for example, the people I spoke to at Fremantle 30 years later are still angry at what the AFL gave them in terms of their concessions and the fact that it hamstrung the club for so long. And it's very important to have a really clear strategy. You talked earlier about the differences between GWS and the Gold Coast, and they'll always be compared because they're one after another. And the Gold Coast, for right or wrong reasons, wanted to get more mature bodies, mid-career players to become their recruits, whereas GWS were adamant that they just wanted to stockpile young players. I think they won 3 games in their first 2 years, and those that were involved with the club were actually bracing not to win a game for a couple of years. They just thought, we're going to cop the early pain because we want all these kids to come and flourish together. Now, you could talk about which direction is the right direction to take, but those that are involved in the Tasmanian list build when it comes, I think you need to have that absolute clarity on the list build strategy. That's important.
Yeah. And on paper, both those strategies sound correct.
Yeah.
I do like I'll always compare those 2 because I did have similar things where they both had a marquee signing in terms of from the NRL, Carmichael Hunt versus Israel Folau, and we both know how those sort of turned out. But if you had to pick, out of all the expansion teams, who probably did things the right way, or is that just determined by how many wins and losses and premierships they eventually get?
Well, I think in the professional sporting world, wins and losses and premierships are what you judge, teams and athletes by. It's a case-by-case scenario if you want to look more holistically. Like the Gold Coast have been nothing short of disappointing on the field, but talking to people involved with that build, what they've done off the field in terms of media rights and participation in Queensland footy and impact on the community, at the club would argue that they've been incredibly successful. So this podcast goes far beyond the wins and losses of each team. Obviously, that's important to a sporting club, but it's more about the off-field impact and the entire club, not just the players that roll out onto the field.
Yeah, absolutely. Niall, thank you so much for coming on and for joining in this collaboration with us. I'm very excited to see how the podcast comes together, even though I'll be the one working on it. Very excited. So AFL Team Builders will be available on all your podcast apps and on this YouTube channel. So, Niall, thank you for coming along to this chat.
No problem. Pleasure.
Thank you. And don't forget to subscribe to the YouTube channel, and you can catch all the latest AFL news at zerohanger.com.